Let's start with a legend. You've probably heard of the man they called the Young Phoenix, the guy who, according to the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, came up with the chain-ship fire plan at Red Cliffs, sparred intellectually with Zhuge Liang, and dazzled everyone with his mysterious brilliance. Now here's the reality check. The official records don't mention him doing any of that. In fact, at the time of the Red Cliffs campaign, Pang Tong was basically a civil servant with a performance review that said, "Brilliant mind, terrible results." The difference between legend and truth here is almost rude. The romance gives us a mythical genius who played with empires like chess pieces. The records of the Three Kingdoms gives us a man who got fired for not being able to run a small county. So, who was Pang Tong really? A misunderstood genius? A bureaucratic burnout? Or a philosopher who showed up in the wrong era with the wrong wardrobe and the right ideas that nobody wanted to hear? The late Han Dynasty was basically Silicon Valley during a crash. Every warlord was trying to recruit talent, but half the resumes were exaggerated and most references had been executed. Liu Bei, the wandering CEO with more dreams than soldiers, was constantly on the lookout for strategic advisors. He already had Zhuge Liang, the polished, managerial, 5-year plan kind of genius. What he lacked was someone who could whisper dangerous ideas in his ear. Someone reckless enough to say, "Stop surviving, start conquering." Enter Pang Tong. He came from a respected scholarly family, had a glowing reputation as a thinker, and impressed the intellectuals of Jingzhou. But when he was appointed as a county magistrate, the ancient equivalent of being made middle management, the place fell apart under him. The locals hated him, the paperwork multiplied like mold, and before long, he was dismissed. The official verdict was brutal. In office, he failed to govern. But there was one man who didn't buy that, Lu Su, one of Sun Quan's top advisors. Lu Su wrote a recommendation letter so over the top it could have been a fan confession. Pang Tong is not fit to manage a county. He's fit to manage a kingdom. That line saved his career. And it tells us a lot about the man. Pang Tong wasn't built for logistics or budgets. He was built for strategy, ideas, and dangerous visions. The kind of guy who can map the future, but shouldn't be trusted with the office keys.
When Pang Tong finally met Liu Bei, things got awkward. Liu Bei expected brilliance wrapped in charisma, a statesman with moral polish, maybe even a touch of mystique. Instead, he got a disheveled scholar with bad posture and an unimpressive presence. The first impression was terrible. Liu Bei barely spoke to him, and Pang Tong, apparently not one to fake enthusiasm, didn't try to charm his way in either. Zhuge Liang and Lu Su had to pull Liu Bei aside and insist, "This man's wisdom matches mine." Imagine being told you just snubbed a genius equal to your star strategist. Liu Bei probably choked on his wine, invited him back, and tried to play it cool. It's one of those great historical near misses, a reminder that even emperors are prone to judging books by the cover, especially when the cover looks like it hasn't slept in 3 days. Once Liu Bei gave Pang Tong real access, the Phoenix began to speak. And what came out wasn't poetry. It was raw, calculated geopolitics. At the time, Liu Bei was stuck in Jingzhou, sandwiched between two predators, Cao Cao's war machine to the north and Sun Quan's ambitions to the east. Pang Tong took one look at the map and said, "This is a trap. You'll never rule anything here. You're basically renting your life month to month." Then he pointed west, to Yi Province, the territory of Liu Zhang. Fertile, defensible, wealthy, but weakly ruled. "This," Pang Tong said, "is where you build your foundation." He outlined 3 plans, the famous upper, middle, and lower strategies. The upper plan was bold and treacherous. Gain entry as a friend, then strike fast and take the province outright. The middle plan was slightly slower. Secure local allies, eliminate resistance, and then move on to Chengdu. The lower plan was diplomatic and tedious. Basically, wait and see. Liu Bei hesitated. He had a moral code and a PR problem. He'd spent years branding himself as the virtuous alternative to opportunists like Cao Cao. Invading a relative's province felt icky. Pang Tong didn't care. He saw that survival in a collapsing empire wasn't about looking righteous, it was about positioning. Righteousness without territory was just poetry. His argument was pure statecraft. You can't serve the people if you don't control the land. Eventually, Liu Bei adopted the middle plan. It wasn't Pang Tong's most ruthless option, but it was the one Liu Bei could live with, both politically and psychologically. What's fascinating about Pang Tong is that he wasn't amoral. He was moral in a way that made rulers uncomfortable. During the campaign, when Liu Bei captured the city of Fu and threw a victory feast, Pang Tong refused to join. Liu Bei asked why. Pang Tong replied, "It is not righteous to rejoice in conquering others." Imagine telling your boss, who just pulled off the biggest military win of his career, that celebrating it makes him unethical. Liu Bei snapped. He threw Pang Tong out of the camp. But when the wine wore off and his temper cooled, he realized he just exiled his best strategist. He called him back. When asked who was at fault for the argument, Pang Tong said, "Both of us." That line sums him up perfectly. Confident enough to challenge power, disciplined enough to stay loyal. He didn't flatter authority. He educated it. A dangerous habit in any age.
Once the Yi province campaign started, Pang Tong was in his element. He wasn't a frontline general like Zhang Fei or Guan Yu. He was the architect of the whole operation. His plan unfolded with cold precision. Liu Bei feigned cooperation with Liu Zhang, used diplomacy to move his army closer, and then struck. Pang Tong recommended executing Liu Zhang's generals Yang Huai and Gao Pei, a shocking but effective opening move. The gates of the province cracked open. But as the army pressed toward Liu Chang, fate intervened. Pang Tong was inspecting the field when an enemy archer loosed a stray arrow. It struck him and killed him instantly. No grand battle, no cinematic duel, just a freak shot in the chaos. He was only in his 30s. It's almost poetic how random it was. The mind that saw empires in maps ended by an arrow that didn't even know its target. When Liu Bei heard of his death, he reportedly broke down and wept. He had lost not just a strategist, but a conscience. Pang Tong's death froze his potential in amber. He never had time to prove himself through long campaigns or governance like Zhuge Liang. All we have are his ideas, and the speed with which Liu Bei's fortunes rose after following them. Within a few years, Liu Bei ruled Yi province, exactly as Pang Tong had predicted. It became the base of the Shu Han state, and every later campaign, from Han Zhong to the northern expeditions, rested on that foundation. If we're tracing cause and effect, Pang Tong was the spark that turned Liu Bei from a wandering commander into a sovereign. Here's where we cut through the fan fiction. Pang Tong wasn't a battlefield genius. There's no record of him commanding armies directly. He wasn't a super manager either. His early failures prove that. He was a strategic intellect, the kind who could look at a geopolitical chessboard and see inevitability before anyone else. Historian Chen Shou compared him to Xun Yu, one of Cao Cao's most brilliant advisors. That's not casual praise. It places him in the highest tier of thinkers, men who designed empires rather than merely served them. But the real question isn't how smart Pang Tong was. It's how usable he was. Zhuge Liang had the temperament of a CEO, organized, calm, and endlessly patient. Pang Tong was the visionary consultant, brilliant in the boardroom, chaos in the back office. He could see 10 moves ahead but tripped over the first 2. He had moral clarity that made allies uneasy and enemies cautious. If he had lived longer, he might have become the ideological heart of Shu, the philosopher-strategist who could articulate why Liu Bei's state deserved to exist. Instead, that job fell to Zhuge Liang, who combined competence with longevity. In short, Pang Tong was the big-picture mind behind one of the most consequential strategic decisions in early Shu history. He wasn't the executor, he was the originator.
Let's look at how the records themselves frame him. The records of the Three Kingdoms describes him as refined in human judgment, diligent in nurturing others, but prone to overrating talent. Translation: he was the kind of boss who called everyone promising and believed idealism could fix mediocrity. It also says that people of Jing and Chu called him a man of high distinction. His reputation among contemporaries was enormous, not because of his achievements, but because of the potential people felt in his intellect. That's a rare thing: respect for unrealized greatness. History usually forgets the ones who die too soon. Pang Tong's ideas were so sharp that even his incomplete career left a silhouette too large to erase. Now, we can't talk about Pang Tong without invoking his eternal comparison, Zhuge Liang. They were the two dragons of Shu, the sleeping dragon and the young phoenix. But the myth of rivalry is misleading. They weren't competitors. They were complements. Zhuge Liang was a system builder, a logistical savant who turned Shu into an efficient bureaucracy. Pang Tong was a disruptor, a strategist who thrived in uncertainty and pre-institutional chaos. If Shu had survived longer, both would have been essential, one to design the machine, the other to point it toward destiny. Instead, fate ran an experiment. Zhuge Liang lived long enough to govern, Pang Tong didn't. And so one became a saint of diligence, the other a symbol of lost genius. Pang Tong's story also offers a fascinating ethical angle. He's often remembered for that line, "It is not righteous to rejoice in conquest." But that moral voice came from someone who advocated conquest. He didn't oppose power. He wanted power used consciously. In a world of opportunists, he was a theorist of moral aggression, conquest as responsibility. That's what made him dangerous. He didn't flatter his ruler to feel good about violence. He made him feel accountable for it. And no autocrat enjoys that kind of honesty. Had he lived longer, Shu might have evolved a more introspective ideology, one balancing ambition with moral awareness. Instead, after his death, the state's tone hardened. The later Shu became more mechanical, more bureaucratic, efficient, but spiritually thin. So how good was Pang Tong, really? In cold historical terms, excellent strategist, mediocre administrator, non-existent general, powerful moral thinker. In cultural terms, he became the archetype of the unfulfilled genius, the one who dies before his theory is tested. The Romantic imagination turned that into mysticism. The records show it was just probability. A stray arrow, 1 second too late. But his fingerprints are still on history. The state of Shu existed because he told Liu Bei to go west. Every campaign Zhuge Liang later launched came from the base Pang Tong told them to seize. He may have died early, but he was right early, and that's rarer. History tends to reward survivors, but sometimes the ones who die young shape more than they could ever govern. Pang Tong was one of them, the phoenix that never rose, but whose ashes fertilized an empire.